Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome today's program Sheila Hewitt, who is Vice President of International Logistics at Transplace. And today we're going to talk about international transportation services are changing. Are you keeping up? Great topic, and particularly here at this time of the year, as many of you are kind of thinking ahead to 2016, and as supply chains continue to get more global and more fragmented. International transportation certainly becomes a more strategic and important part of the operations of many shippers out there. And it's certainly something that there's a lot of change going on in that segment of the industry. So keeping a pulse on what's happening there and how to succeed in this environment is, something I know is top of mind to a lot of the shippers that I talk to. So very privileged to have with us today, Sheila, to kind of talk through some of these topics and questions that we have. Just want to remind those of you that are joining us live today that part of our goal here at Talking Logistics is to make this conversational. So if you do have a question for Sheila as we're having our conversation here, you can do so via the Submit a Question button. And, if we've got time and it's a good and appropriate question, we'll weave it into the conversation. I do want to remind you that if you are joining us as a visitor, you do have to sign in first before you can ask a question. So with that, Sheila, welcome to the program.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Sheila, when we have, whenever we have a new guest on Talking Logistics, before we kind of dive into the topic, I always like to learn a little bit about their background, how and why they got into this industry. So why don't we start there? Why don't you tell us a little bit about, your career path, how and why you got involved in the logistics industry, and what your current role and responsibilities are there at Transplace.
Sure. Joined Transplace in 2009 as the vice president responsible for international sales, operations, and systems. Prior to that, almost 30 years plus at this point. So that's been a blend of a customer perspective, whether it be import, export, apparel. Also have run and operated distribution centers, private fleets. Forgive me, my screen just went quiet. Also, I've worked on the service provider side. Let's see if I can get you back now. Sorry, technical difficulties. Well, Adrian, this is not good. There we go.
Can you see me? Okay, it seems like I'm going to go ahead and refresh the screen.
I'm back. Sorry about
Sheila,
that.
can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Can you hear me okay, Sheila? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and refresh the screen. I'm getting a couple of notes here that folks can't see or hear me. So let me go ahead and refresh the screen and see if that fixes things. Hold on.
Sure.
Sheila, can you see and hear me?
I can.
Stephen and Christian, if you could let me know if you can see and hear me before we move forward, that'd be great. Okay, great. So it seems like folks can see and hear us now. Don't know why. I know we can see. We saw and heard each other to begin with there. So anyway, you were kind of talking about your career path there. It's certainly a broad experience in a variety of different industries and a variety of different roles in the logistics industry, which is great because I think it's always so helpful to really have that broad perspective, both from a shipper side, a service provider side, and then obviously not only transportation but warehousing and distribution centers. I mean, because all these business processes really have to work together to succeed. So let's get into it now in terms of talking about international transportation, and let's kind of start with a question suggested by the title, and that is, how is international transportation landscape different today than in the past?
It's much more higher velocity. I think greater demands are expected. I think corporations and leadership have finally recognized that logistics is more than just a necessity. is actually core to the business. So management is also expected to make decisions in real time, which it makes them heavily dependent on accurate data, the access to data, and to make business decisions based on that. So I think gone are the days where traditionally you would set forth a annual plan, a procurement exercise, and you'd lay out your strategy, and then perhaps a year later you'd come back and measure your level of success. I think today it would be challenging to do it almost on a daily basis. So it's extremely dynamic. You have to be well in tune with a lot of variables, and I think data is the primary source for being able to accomplish that.
No, that's a great point, and I think you hit on something that certainly throughout this year we've talked a lot about in this program, and that is particularly from a procurement standpoint, as an example, where kind of setting things up once a year is just not something that many shippers can deal with anymore in terms of because of so many changes going on in the industry that they really have to keep a pulse on what's happening because the operating reality and their goals and objectives when they kind of set about to do the procurement engagement was one snapshot of reality, but then 3 months, 4 months, 5 months down the road, things could be completely changed, and having to respond to that and keeping a pulse on what's happening, I think is critically important. Certainly in the news, just recently you're seeing a lot of mergers between ocean carriers, as an example. Certainly a lot of buzz earlier this year with the Panama Canal and what impact that might have. Are those things that you're seeing as well? Just as examples of things that are kind of impacting some of the shippers that you work with?
Sure. I think the consolidation between the ocean carriers and potential other 3PLs is going to continue for another couple of years, likely. So it further enforces the need to have an infrastructure, an IT infrastructure that's extremely strong but flexible and agile so that you can adopt without disrupting your business. You can adopt to those changing environments and still have that integration strategy that is suitable to have that flexibility because the players are changing. The level of interaction that you're going to have with perhaps a provider that wasn't even in your core group has now been introduced through a merger or an acquisition. So the solidified IT infrastructure is just vital to being able to navigate these sort of churning waters.
Yeah, and I want to dive a little bit deeper later on the whole IT infrastructure and the capabilities there, because obviously that plays a key role there in terms of providing business intelligence and visibility and analytics to shippers around this area. But when you look at kind of the more dynamic and environment out there, what kind of new challenges is this presenting for shippers?
I think senior management is pressing organizations, whether they're retail, CPG, manufacturing, they're constantly looking for cost reduction. And traditionally, companies have looked to ocean logistics for part of that savings. And in a market where we're near historic lows, that's become even a bigger challenge to drive cost savings out of the logistics expense. So I think the main focus is shifted to more of efficiency, specifically into an inventory environment, inventory planning, inventory management, particularly for the retailers as they are working through this multi-channel effort. That brings about new issues that just haven't been present before. So the ability to better plan around your forecast and inventory planning predicated on good data analysis, and then knowing where that inventory is, where in the pipeline, where in the supply chain is it? And do I need to make very quick decisions to make an adjustment in that inventory plan based on real-time analysis?
Yeah, great point. I think you hit on something else that certainly was a topic of conversation a lot this year. And, it's nothing new, right? I think, supply chain logistics executives have continuously tried to balance, transportation costs with inventory costs and kind of looking at, supply and demand and try to create all the, look at all the trade-offs and, how to balance all of that. But certainly, the equation keeps changing. When you look at the price of oil, for example, today versus what it was a year ago and what it was, just a few years back, that has an impact obviously on transportation costs. And then you look at interest rates and what's happening there, and that has an impact on inventory carrying costs and kind of the policies that companies have with regards to holding inventory. So I think, those are, like you said, kind of looking at efficiencies, looking cost reductions, and trying to balance and taking a holistic perspective between transportation and inventory, I think is more critical than ever. Obviously, you work at TransPlace now and a service provider, and many shippers rely on, 3PL partners to produce, to procure, plan and execute their international, transportation processes. Considering everything we just talked about, how have 3PL services evolved to meet shipper needs? And, can you give us some use case examples?
Absolutely, and it has evolved into a much more meaningful collaborative partnership. We're not a service provider, perhaps. We're more of a partner, and sometimes we understand the customer's business maybe to a greater extent than they do. For example, we see a lot of very large companies who do a good job of the strategic procurement from an ocean RFQ standpoint. But then it seems to have a gap between how did we do from an execution standpoint against that original plan. We also are hearing more senior managers come to us and say, I can't answer the question, what is the health of my supply chain? How do we fare against others in a similar industry? So they're looking for answers. A 3PL partnership actually can come in an agnostic fashion and do a current state assessment. We do this frequently at TransPlace, and it's amazing. We find redundancies in processes, we find gaps, we certainly identify risk, but we go outside of logistics to put together that well-defined plan. So we speak to finance, we speak to production, we speak to sales, we talk to the plant and manufacturing facilities. They all have a critical piece of which logistics impacts their world. So we really do look at it holistically from an end-to-end supply chain, not just the logistics portion. I can speak to a recent conclusion we've done now. It took us around a year for a large CPG organization whereby we did exactly that, came in and did an assessment and quickly identified some immediate benefits, cost savings, and certainly some efficiencies. But more importantly, we gave them control and visibility. We gave them a strategy that they could move forward as a vision and allowed us to take on the tactical burden of day-to-day operations. So it's released them from the burden of the day-to-day, while yet they still have complete control, visibility, and the ability to make changes quickly and truly assess how is their business, what is it they need to address from a priority standpoint.
Great example, and I think you underscored a couple of things also that earlier this year we had your colleague Brooks Benz participate, and he talked about the need to take a portfolio management approach to transportation, really advocating the need to really take a holistic and integrated view of transportation, not just ocean, not just truckload, not just LTL, not just rail or really looking at it as a complete picture, and then also integrating that with your, company strategy, how it relates to, how it integrates with manufacturing and sourcing strategy, so on and so forth. And I think that's a, critical area that I see a lot of shippers, looking for support around. So I think, the example you gave is, a great one there. The other area that I see a lot, and it's something I've written a lot about is, a lot of shippers, when I talk to them, when they're looking at their 3PL partners, I mean, they're looking for what I've characterized the right mix of services, technology, and consulting or advice. And, I think that's where, I kind of see the market heading. And so now let's talk about one of those components, which is the technology piece, which you've talked about a little bit already. But I just want to dive a little bit deeper and get some additional thoughts and insights on that. In a recent blog post, you wrote that IT infrastructure is critical to global supply chain. How so?
As you stated, right now there are multiples of service providers that are very good in certain areas, so you need a niche carrier and another provider perhaps by lane, by opportunity, by product. It's a very complex model to manage that level of service provider fragmentation, and the concern that I always have in that environment is the associated risk. So if you have a consolidated IT infrastructure, a system of record where all of the data is housed in a single source, that data is extremely powerful. Another theory I have is that data drives ownership and accountability. So it's not based on thoughts or speculation or trend setting. It's based on actual data captured in real time, and it does drive ownership. You can identify fairly quickly what the root cause analysis is, what's the resolution plan, how do we get there, and then measure against that to make certain that you're still in alignment with your original execution plan. But it is heavily predicated on a solid IT infrastructure.
No, absolutely. And, certainly over the past couple of years, kind of seen this movement toward, control towers, this movement toward, having a platform in place to bring, this data and information from, disparate places where they reside into a single, kind of platform and be able to then provide a single version of the truth, if you will, in terms of, and then have that drive, actions and insights. Kind of related to that, I mean, one of the things that has always been a challenge has been data quality management, right? So it's a classic, garbage in, garbage out. How do you kind of manage that, or what's your thoughts on data quality management and kind of the value perhaps of taking ownership of that on behalf of a shipper?
It's become much better now than it has in many years. I'm proud of the success from even the ocean carriers, but the ability to standardize much of this information, and again, when you have large customers with they carry a lot of clout and a lot of power, you start to not only standardize the process, but you're standardizing the way that the data is received and how it's pushed and transmitted. So we are making great strides with our particular automated service providers, whereby we work on mapping to say if you have a different UN load code than perhaps another carrier, we have the ability to translate those tables so that we do have consistent, when it comes to reporting, that data accuracy and consistent is a must. So we are extremely focused on standardizing and resolving it in our system so that the data is received as SAP is cleaned and valuable data. I don't want to also lose a point, please, Adrienne, is when we're talking about IT infrastructure, we look at it from three parallels. We look at it from the actual physical movement of the goods itself. The data has to move as well. And then the documentation, which I make reference to compliance and regulatory issues. If any of those three things are not flowing in sync, then you have an issue. So we have to continue to address the overall issue with that. Or give me for a moment here. So we're losing me again. So from a data quality standpoint, sorry, go ahead. I'm having issues again.
No, I was just going to say that we can still see and hear you. So I don't, if your screen is going to screensaver mode, we can still see you.
Well, then I'll just keep talking. So when those three parallels fall out of sync and you've got multiple systems and multiple providers, for example, an ocean carrier, a dray carrier, and a customs broker, it's just critical that you have a system that can, from a business logic standpoint, ensure that that continues to move forward.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I think when we talk about international transportation, obviously the first thing that comes to mind is just the physical movement of the goods. But as you just talked about there, it's the recognition that there are these ancillary processes and other movements that have to take place to make that as streamlined and friction-free as possible, and that is the flow of information as well and the flow of documents, and particularly the regulatory and side of things. So that's a great that's a great point. I just want to remind those of you that are joining us live that if you do have a question for Sheila, as we're kind of coming up on time here, now would be the time to ask as I kind of come up to my final 2 or 3 questions here. So let's kind of talk about measuring performance around international transportation. I mean, what are some key metrics companies should consider implementing around this area?
Yeah, I think we've matured well past the carrier scorecard, if you will, and lane level volume detail. To us, it's more operationally centric. So we first establish what is the expectation goal line. What's the baseline for that organization? I think that's important for everyone to understand, one, the expectation of that particular customer, but it's the line from which performance is judged. From that, you build business decision KPIs. What is it that the business is going to need to achieve the goals set forth? So when you have those identified exceptions based on the collection data that we've done, you now have the ability to actually perform the forensics, to look into that data, look for the root cause. We're finding unique KPIs that are very meaningful to the business success, like, was that a logistics issue or was it a production issue? Are we calculating our lead times on production? Is it predicated on an inaccurate or an old transit time? Are we looking at that transit time in a dynamic environment? Are we disappointing our customers because we don't have visibility to that real-time data, which is out here in the marketplace? We're using it here at Transplace. So there are many factors that go, again, outside those traditional logistics KPIs that are driving meaningful business decisions.
Those are great examples. I mean, I think I would add to the list, building off what we talked about earlier, is data quality management related metrics, just to make sure that data is timely, accurate, and complete, coming from the various trading partners and carriers that are involved in that process. So let's before kind of we wrap up, kind of looking ahead now to 2016. Are there any trends that companies should be aware of that could impact international transportation operations in the coming year or beyond?
I think the biggest trend, a couple of things. We're seeing more and more regulatory influence on the overall processes. I'll speak to Sheilas, which is now the new weight reporting requirement, which again, we're going to have to build that functionality and logic into all of our systems so that we're capturing that as a must-have data, so that the continuing automated process has a stop, that you can't fall out of compliance. We are a very compliance-focused organization when we're building our processes and our systems. And I think, too, the continued consolidation between carriers, 3PLs, that adds a lot of unforeseen havoc and could disrupt anyone's supply chain. So that has to be monitored and managed. And again, I think that's through good relationships with your 3PL, but then again, the integration of data into that single source that you mentioned. Just the control and the visibility of quality data, and I think everyone will be able to navigate just fine.
No, I'm glad you mentioned Sheilas. I mean, that's something that certainly has gotten on the radar of a lot of shippers today, in terms of being able to accurately communicate the weight of these ocean containers and such. So I think we're going to be hearing a lot more about that in the days and weeks ahead for sure. We're kind of coming up short on time here. So kind of as a way to wrap up, I mean, what questions should shippers ask themselves to assess their international transportation operations, and what steps can they take today to kind of improve?
There are two things based on recent experiences here. One, I'm a big fan of creating a steering committee within an organization that is specific to logistics design, but it brings in the other cross-functional groups. I think it's a collaborative effort that has a lot of value. And then I also have met recently with a very large chemical company whose performance standards, according to executives, were unacceptable. So once we got into the data mining for their group, turns out it was just bad data. So the performance standards were actually higher, much higher than they realized, but the data quality coming from their service providers was poor. So again, data creates accountability and ownership, and I think we all have to hold our 3PLs, our service providers, and our other carriers. We have to hold them accountable for the level of quality that we get from them. It does drive and impact our business.
Great ideas and recommendations and insights there. We're kind of out of time for today, Sheila. As I always say at the end of every episode, we always manage just to scratch the surface on these timely and important topics. But certainly, I think we got the wheels turning. We raised some good topics, and certainly you shared some good ideas and food for thought for people to truly consider, particularly around international transportation in the coming year. So again, thank you for making the time to be with us today.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I want to thank those of you that joined us live today. We didn't get any questions live, but if you are watching this on demand, you can find this episode on talkinglogistics.com. And if you've got a question for Sheila, you can post a question or comment there, and I'm sure that she'll be more than happy to follow up via that medium. Again, thank you all for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.